Well, perhaps I'll start us off with one thought, and then we'll turn it over to the floor for discussion and questions to Roger and Selina. Coming at this from a somewhat Nietzschean direction, one thought that I have is that the shadows of God, something Nietzsche talks about, may still be lingering in the way that we think about ephemerality and permanence. We still have this lingering idea, I definitely have it myself, that the atemporal is ultimately what's going to give us meaning. We have time, change, ephemera, but somehow we need to find eternity in the moment, or need to find permanence in the moment. And I think that's something that Nietzsche would be very suspicious of and would press us on, to ask, what is it that appeals to us in this view, and is it something that should appeal to us?
Well, I've tried to say what it is to me, namely that the only things that we have, things here and now, can be, as it were, turned round on themselves so as to be significant in another way. So you rescue them in the way that art rescues everything it touches, and that we have the same obligation in our life, and that's what we do, perhaps through love and through anger, sometimes through good works, etc.
It's difficult for me coming as a Catholic. So I take the sort of the Beckett view, which is the bastard, he doesn't exist. So there's always in place of God. I mean, I can't get rid of that place of God, and therefore for me that sort of that meaning, the transcendent, is constantly there, and I can't imagine a world actually where there isn't that longing, or understand it, I don't think.
Well, I had the good fortune to be brought up have brought myself up as an Anglican. The Anglican Church describes itself as Catholic in its service, but as Protestant in its public aspect. And it's managed, but through juggling with these things ever since the Reformation, it's managed to produce a body of ritual which doesn't require very much in the matter of belief at all. The important thing is that there are these sacred moments, birth, death, marriage, etc., and you participate in that, but the rest is a sort of mystery, really. It doesn't matter if you can't get your mind around it.
Ray.
Thank you both for your talks. I really enjoyed it. But my question is addressed to Roger, which is about the intersection between time and eternity. I mean, it's full of bitter ironies, this kind of intersection. I was thinking of a light irony, Thomas Traherne saying, "I saw eternity the other night," and that kind of clash between a sort of weekday sense and eternity. Or when you're hurrying late for church, for the Eucharist, as if it were a booked meal and so on, there's that intersection. But I just wondered whether eternity, as well as being elusive, is also somehow inescapable in our very language, that the tokens, the words we use, are in time. They occur, but their meanings don't occur. And I wonder if that was actually the intuition that has driven the whole Platonic strand of thought throughout Western culture. And I'm just throwing it out as a possibility.
Well, Plato makes this explicit. The theory of the eternal is another realm inhabited, or if that's the right word, filled with things which neither begin nor end, like meanings. Meanings are his paradigm case. I mean, that's what the forms are.
And the fact that we can all participate in meaning makes them either, if they belong then to the community of minds, not even posh things like the good and the true, but even ontological proles like hair and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And it seems to me that, I guess that is something that consciously or unconsciously has driven a lot of our thinking. I know, in a way, Selina sort of referred to the Platonic input into our thinking about eternity and into the democratization of eternity.
Yeah, I mean, this is all also suggested by what Daniel said about infinity being rather a smaller number than those big numbers that mathematicians deal with. Because clearly you've stepped into another realm when you're talking of the transfinite.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I also have one small question for Roger, because you mentioned the transcendental and said that, you know, it's that which we cannot talk about, you know. But if you define it, as I think you did, as a kind of point of view on the world, then it's actually not quite clear to me why it is that we cannot really talk about it. I mean, isn't self-conscious reflection doing exactly that? What is it about the idea that, you know, reflecting on your point of view that still eludes us, or that doesn't allow for it? I mean, that's why I think Heidegger is quite good at this. You know, he describes it as a circular activity. Of course, there's some interpretation that you're coming from by looking at your own self, but you can still kind of talk about it. You can still talk about your point of view. What is it that you think sort of gives us that extra dimension of elusiveness?
Well, I know this is a deep point, and I'm not sure what to say. I mean, Sartre says that the I is a nothingness, doesn't he? For this reason that I can no more make the subject, the I, an object of my own awareness than I can see my own eyes by looking at them, so to speak. It's always, wherever I turn my attention, it's the subject is not the thing attended to, but the thing attending, so to speak. So it's always flitting away behind my attention. I mean, that's an image, but you get similar ideas in Kant and Wittgenstein, and I think in Heidegger. I'm not an expert on that, but I think if you take seriously the idea of the self as subject, as the thing that's doing all this observing, rather than one of the objects that's observed, then I think you must acknowledge that it's going to be systematically elusive.
But the thing that's looking does have content, right? I mean, that's what I'm interested in. So it's not that like we all see the same thing, right? It's not like we're all the one, you know, we're all looking first personally, but we actually do experience it in some sort of perceptual lens, yes. and it's that which we can talk about, right?
I think Julian gave this lovely example of that painting by Angerman, in which he tries to show what it is to have in your vision this utterly meaningless images of the meaningful, of meaningless destruction. And he shows the family looking at the television. He can't actually show the looking or be part of the looking, but he represents that looking by artistic means, so that you do for that moment see the world in their eyes, and you cast judgment on their way of seeing. But that's fine. And I think that's what we expect art to do, to take us into the subjective arena of people, but without making that subjective arena into itself an object. That's well.
Sebastian?
Since you raised the Nietzschean suspicion, and my question is, I don't know. For Andrew. Yeah. Roger answered you. I wondered whether or not what would suffice in Nietzsche's terms to allay the suspicion that these conceptions are mere residues, shadows of religious belief. And would it just be the story that Selina told? I mean, if that story is right, and if these beliefs and investments came about for these reasons, should we accept that as the end of it? These things are then explained, over and done with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's one issue about what would explain why we hold the view, and I think it's hard to know what would allay the doubts there, but I think a historical story of the sort that Selina is giving would be in the right direction. But I think the sort of substantive content of the view that Nietzsche would be looking for would be a view where we can actually celebrate the ephemerality of things without needing to couch it in terms of permanence, where we escape from this idea that I think he sees as very oppressive, that we can only lend things seriousness, weight, and value if we couch things in the language of eternity. And I think it's a temptation we see in Nietzsche himself. He's always drawn to doing this, but I think he fights against it as well.
Could I just say one more thing quickly? I wonder, it's a question whether or not the Nietzschean conception of celebrating the ephemerality, I wonder whether or not that's at variance with the conception that Mark described yesterday of what value is for Heidegger. That's not really a question for this panel, but I just recalled it.
It is a good question.
I'd love to just ask you and Roger that the battle in Plato between the democratization of immortality, but at the same time the devaluation of the individual, and how that seems to be such a contradiction.
Well, yes. Obviously, Diotima, whom you quote in the Symposium, her solution to all the paradoxes of erotic love is to say that actually this feeling, this attraction towards the individual beautiful boy is a kind of mistake. It's the first step towards something else.
But you're using the individual as a stepping stone then,
yes,
to this
to
idea.
the eternal.
And isn't that a terrible danger of transcendence?
Yes, that's why you have to. I mean, there's the only answer to someone like you is not the Platonic one, but something more like the one that I'm trying to put across. That there is such a thing as the real presence that can be defined, that can be understood without invoking that transcendental object of which this is the presence. That's thought.
Right.
There's what is the Hebrew word for it? Begins with an S. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Question for you, Selina. Why do you think this idea of immortality took hold in Christianity in the way that it did? You've given us a beautiful juxtaposition with some earlier views where mortality was limited to the few or not thought about as important at all. What do you see as the driving force behind this change?
I think it's partly the Platonic influence, but it must also be the influence of a small group living in a large empire, rather like the Jews found themselves as this small, slightly persecuted group who've got to, their way of surviving is to say, we'll give stuff to Caesar and then we avoid Caesar coming down on us. But we've got this separate spiritual realm that's ours, that we occupy. And
right, and I would add to that this vision becomes individualized in time, that the separate spiritual realm is a personal possession of each of us. That's the romantic thought, isn't it? That's what's expressed in the look motive.
And of course, but it is a wonderful way of, if you want to spread a religion, what a great way to do it, by offering everyone the possibility of eternal bliss.
Andrew?
Yeah, so just really an observation for Roger, which is that it strikes me that this form of seeking the eternal in the moment by going down into that moment and finding some sense of the transcendental there is very much a child of post-Enlightenment thinking. And it's absolutely central, for example, to Wordsworth. The Prelude is almost the text demonstration of what you describe. It's a man's attempt to salvage from his life what he calls the spots of time, the moments like when he was rowing as a boy on the lake and he felt something greater than himself somehow enter his experience of the world. And he explicitly, in the structure of his poem, which is written in 12 books, he is rewriting Paradise Lost, which is the great poem of English Reformation Christian belief, in which absolutely everything is given a total God-centered meaning, and everything that doesn't relate to God and those who don't believe in God are just consigned totally to hell forever. Wordsworth takes that structure and makes it about the perceiving self, finding the infinite in the moment. But by adopting the structure of this tyrannical great poem that came before, he is evidently saying, well, this is the romantic way of finding truth. But ultimately, it seems to me that if you take a rational view, this leads to tragedy. And the example of that would be Coleridge. There's a wonderful book about Coleridge called Coleridge and the Pantheist Tradition by Thomas Macfarlane, in which he explains the cause of Coleridge's nervous breakdown, which can be traced to a particular poem called the Aeolian Harp. And in that poem, Coleridge experiences a Wordsworthian moment of infinity and beauty. It's the Aeolian harp, it's a wind harp, and it's chiming, and he's in the lakes, and everything's beautiful. And then suddenly there's a storm, and the Aeolian harp is blown away, and everything is smashed, and Coleridge realizes, well, if I'm going to find the eternal in the world, if I'm going to look to the world, to real experience for my sense of meaning, I'm going to have to reckon with, well, the earthquake that God has just caused 20,000 people to die in Lisbon. This is the problem that he's experiencing, which is either the transcendent is up there, but if you start trying to find it down here, you have to reckon with all these other moments, so that you don't just find heaven, you find a lot of hell. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me that that's in a way what Nietzsche is trying to tell us all. Reckon with the hell. And how do you explain the hell within this romantic approach? So in the end, it seems to me that either you believe in God or you don't, and if you don't believe in God, you've got a problem.
That's a huge intervention, very important. You're absolutely right that, of course, I'm talking about a particular tradition, a romantic tradition, which tries to put self-redemption in the place of redemption by the Almighty. And that is absolutely true, but my view is that is, if you like, an awakening to what our condition actually is. And that even though there are bad moments as well as good moments, there are still these, we still have available to us the possibility of seeing these moments simply as spread out in chronos time without an explanation, or as moments in which our own being is involved. And I think, suffering is part of this too. If you like, it's a kind of spiritual exercise in which art is one of the most important parts, and that's what Wordsworth showed. The Prelude is far more plausible as an account of human nature than Paradise Lost, even though it lacks what Milton had, which is that sense of the erotic. But we're in the position of the post-Enlightenment figures that you were talking about. We're not in the position of Milton, but we're not lost.
Yeah, that's what I was really asking.
Yes.
Do you find sufficient consolation?
No consolation is sufficient, because we for the reasons Nietzsche says, that we long beyond anything that we're given, but at least we're given a bit.
But the problem with that sort of romantic transcendence is that it's incredibly self-absorbed. So that the romantic landscape is simply a background to your own feelings. It's the sort of Childe Harold high mountains are a feeling. And they're more than a feeling.
I think I would say that it has a corrupt form which is self-absorbed, certainly. But if you see the self properly, as I was trying to do, namely not as an object to be cherished, but as a subject to observe, then that's fine. You're not absorbed. You can't actually have full self-consciousness without being absorbed in something else.
But even if the observing object then just sees the world as something for them, but only them.
Yeah, but then he has to grow out of that.
But perhaps the final question from Geoffrey, and then we'll draw to a close.
As we talk about, the romantic idea of something far more deeply interfused, that we sort of think it may be God or whatever. Every artist in the Romantic period and is usually looking at nature, and when you think about it, nature has absolutely no agenda. It is completely indifferent. As it seems to me, God is also. And so I have a question. The Aborigines of Australia believe, they're the oldest people on earth, they believe that life is the dream time and that true life begins with death, which would be that we would become part of this indifference, of this indifferent world that we see as an indifferent world, because, as you say, Roger, we can't see our own eyes. We can't see the back of our head. We can't even see our face without a mirror. But, I mean, is it possible just to conceive that there is a natural physical law that is eternal and unchanging? After all, music has come from that natural world. Strings were from animals, I mean, and hide and wood and everything. And it's just an idea that I have. I mean, I'm sorry, but I can't put philosophy on the mantelpiece. I always think it's plumbing. And I'm trying to find my own little reasons.
I would say that the Aboriginal idea of the dream time is another way of saying that there are rival experiences of time. There is the chronos time against the kairos time, as I was putting it, but that it is open to us as self-conscious beings to step back in this way and see the way in which mere temporality intersects with the eternal meaning of things. And we all know this from music. As you say, music, these are natural objects, these things that we play. But there's no greater symbol of the sound of eternity than the didgeridoo, isn't there? You know, that object is suddenly transformed into the voice of God just by blowing into it.
And that, of course, has nothing to do, I mean, the eternality of music is nothing to do with the eternal nature of the individual. I mean, it's the two are different.
I don't know, that's why I talk about mise en abîme, because the object is the end and the end is the object. And I don't know, I think we're not enjoying life enough. We're not playing enough, maybe.
Yes.
Well, on that note, perhaps we should enjoy the ephemerality of food and drink and draw the discussion to a close.